Hey, this is The Decibel from the Globe and Mail. I'm Tamara Kandaker. Ron Siwicki is a free man again after spending 2 years in prison. It's been more than 7 years since his mother, Betty, died, and since Ron was charged with killing her. The circumstances of her death made national headlines. Ron had left Betty on the floor of her bedroom for weeks. He fed her and gave her water, but he couldn't lift her up and he didn't ask for help. Ron was a popular guy on the Winnipeg music scene, and to his friends, the whole thing was incomprehensible. He may have failed his mother, but they couldn't accept that he was guilty of killing her. He was just a man in his 60s with his own health issues. He got overwhelmed. He was trying to respect the wishes of a woman who wanted to die in her own home. Wency Leung is a health reporter, and she recently interviewed Ron and the people in his life to try and understand what happened.
I kind of had a hunch that there was more to the story than this monster who left his mother to die.
Today on The Decibel, was Betty Siwicki's death a tragedy or a crime? Let's get into it. Wency, you talked to Ron Siwicki for hours. Can you tell me a little bit about what he's like?
Even his friends will describe him this way. Ron is a bit different. He can kind of spit out just all sorts of trivia, and he can spit out dates and names. And I know my memory certainly doesn't work that way. He has this very sort of vulnerable vibe about him. He had actually told me at one point, even when he was in prison, there were hardened criminals who kind of felt protective of him.
And I know he was really close to his mom, Betty. So how do you think his relationship with his mom shaped his personality?
Whatever his mom wanted for him, he would do. And he will tell you that it's not the case that she wouldn't let him do things or wouldn't let him travel or do things like that. But from the sense I get, she was really his world.
I want to play you this clip from Dave McCrae, who's a friend of Ron Siwicki's. With his permission, you've shared your recording of that interview with us.
I think I knew him as well as anyone did.
Oh, right. Okay. And
which is part of the tragedy here, is that we didn't realize how the train had gone off the tracks, because when I first went to his house, probably in the early 2000s, it was just a totally normal house.
Oh, really?
His mother. His mother was there, and, they had nice furniture, nice little house, nice furniture, and, it was neat and tidy, and it was just like any other of the tens of thousands of houses of normal people living.
So Ron's mom, she died in 2014, and I wonder if you can outline briefly what happened in her final years that Dave and Ron's other friends didn't know about.
Ron and his mom developed issues with hoarding. So the house became really cluttered, and we might be able to kind of understand how that can happen, especially during this pandemic. You start letting certain things go, and then you let them go a little bit further, and, eventually it can get much worse than you had ever intended. The washing machine broke down, the furnace broke down. It sounds like Ron just couldn't keep up with that. So there's this situation about the house and also the situation with his mother and his own health. Their health started deteriorating.
And what was happening with her health at the time?
So there was the memory issue, which after her death, the coroner found out that she had dementia. But she was also in kind of poor health in terms of her blood pressure, thyroid issues, and her mobility was also declining as well.
And how was Ron trying to take care of her? What was he doing to try and help her?
I guess at the start of things, he was the person who would make sure she had food and make sure she was taking her medications and everything. When Ron's sister died, I think that was a really big moment for their family. So Ron's sister was possibly the last link that Betty had to sort of the outside world. She just kind of never got over it. So as Ron was explaining to me, she hadn't had the best perspective on hospitals and doctors to begin with. But the death of his sister, which was also in hospital and kind of unexpected, at least to Betty and Ron, that death kind of made her just shirk all medical attention. She didn't want to see a doctor after that. She had a fear that if she were ever to go to hospital, she would die there.
So what do we know about the circumstances of Betty's death?
For several weeks before she died, and we're not entirely sure when, likely about 4 weeks before she died, she had fallen out of her bed and was laying on the floor, and Ron wasn't able to get her back into bed or back up. So she had lain there for likely up to 4 weeks or so. On the day that she did die, Ron mentioned that at some point she was having trouble breathing. He checked in on her later, and she had stopped breathing. And he tried CPR on her and couldn't revive her. At some point, he kind of took the blanket off her and was shocked at the state of her body. And he told me that he didn't want anyone to see her in that condition. Mm-hmm. So he had tried to clean her up as much as possible and moved her body into the hallway. And that's where the first responders first came to the house, found her. It was a team of firefighters who first came in and saw the state that her body was in, and they were the ones who alerted police to come.
So what was her actual cause of death?
The cause of death was deemed to be from the bed sores that she had developed while she was lying on the floor. They became infected, and it was sepsis that ultimately was the cause of death.
Okay, so she may have been laying there for weeks, and that's why Ron Siwicki was charged with her death.
Yes, like in terms of him not calling for help when his mom fell off her bed. What the judge mentioned in her judgment was that Betty's death could have been completely prevented had he called 911 much sooner. So the crime that he pleaded guilty to was criminal negligence.
There is a clip of your interview with him about why his mom refused help. And I think it might help to hear from Ron himself to kind of better understand how things could have gotten so bad.
All kinds of people I could get to help. Yeah. But my mom would absolutely refuse any kind of help because she wasn't convinced that she was really sick.
Mm-hmm. Did she get angry at you?
Yeah, she was annoyed. I mean, twice she said to me, "Ron, why are you trying to make me look like a fool?" Mm. And that was certainly, I would never try to do that. Mm-hmm. I just wanted...
Ron, are you there? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just wanted to get her help.
Mm-hmm.
That's really heartbreaking to hear. So it's clear that Ron did try to get help for his mom, but he couldn't really go against her wishes. What about her doctors? Why couldn't they help her?
Well, I think that it's kind of a murky territory in terms of how do you give treatment to somebody who refuses it? Unless someone consents to it, you can't just go in and give them medical care.
And what about Ron's friends? They were in the dark about what was happening at home, but when Betty died and he was charged, what was their reaction?
Yeah, they were all really shocked. They had no idea what was going on at the house. An acquaintance of Ron went out of his way and gathered reference letters for Ron. He sort of rallied people to go to his bail hearing, and they showed up in court in droves. I was told there's as many people inside the courtroom as there were out in support of Ron.
It also sounds like they couldn't really accept that Ron should be held responsible for his mother's death. Why do you think that is? Like, what was the disconnect there?
Yeah, I think it was because they knew what Ron was like, that he was really not a malicious person. And they knew he wasn't the type of person who would intentionally kill his mother. And I think they found it just unfair that, Ron himself was in his mid to late 60s at the time. And I think they just found there was no sort of justification to penalize him for something that he didn't mean to happen.
But he was also her caregiver, right? And I guess I would push back and ask, doesn't a caregiver have more of a duty or higher duty than just not actively killing someone or not intending to kill someone?
Yeah, and I think that was what the judge had ultimately decided, is that he failed in his duty as a caregiver. Yeah, and so in that sense, there needed to be some consequences for that. If you talk to medical ethicists, they will mention that if the person you're caring for is incapable of making decisions in his or her own best interest as a caregiver, it's your responsibility to do that. And part of that is actually knowing what their wishes would have been. In this case, and in a case where somebody would have wanted to die at home without medical care, I don't know. I don't know that there is like a good answer.
So Ron was first charged with manslaughter, but then pled guilty to criminal negligence causing death. He got 3 months. And then on the appeal, he was sentenced to another 21 months in prison. What did those two judges disagree on that made those two sentences so different?
So on the appeal, a few of the reasons why the appeals court judges gave him a prolonged sentence was because they felt that the sentencing judge didn't give proper weight to some of the aggravating factors. Among them was that Betty was very vulnerable, that her death was very easily preventable, and that she would have been in quite a significant amount of pain until the nerves around where her infections had died. And there was that prolonged period when she was lying on the floor where he did not seek help. And the reason why the Crown also was seeking a longer sentence was, in part as a deterrence to, show that caregivers have this duty to get medical attention for people in their care.
Why do you think this case has divided friends and judges? And what was your thought process when you were considering Ron's guilt in all of this?
I came to this with a pretty open mind. I wasn't sure what to expect. What I did think was really particular about Ron's case was just how much support he did get from his friends. And that kind of piqued my interest in what was going on there. So I kind of had a hunch that there was more to the story than this monster who left his mother to die, which, sounds really awful. And then to see the amount of support that he got, that really kind of piqued my interest into digging into a little bit more about what the story was. Mm. But in terms of like how I feel, regardless of how I personally feel about it, I think that the real punishment for Ron, unfortunately, is still ongoing. He's a free man now, but the weight of what happened and the weight of letting his mom down, that is the punishment that will kind of dog him for the rest of his life.
In your reporting, you found that Ron's case is far from the only one with a death like this. Can you tell us a bit about other examples?
There are other examples that were cited in the sentencing of family caregivers who did not give the appropriate care that was warranted for the people that they were taking care of. And there are some extreme and horrible examples of, elderly relatives dying and having infected pressure wounds to the point of having their limbs like rotting. So these cases do exist. Mm. I think one of the things about Ron's case also is that it highlights questions about what we do right now in the pandemic in the wake of what has happened in long-term care. And you mentioned asking about other examples of this. And to some extent, those examples exist nationally and at a broader level.
I also couldn't help but draw the line between what happened in Ron's home to what happened in long-term care homes across the country when the pandemic hit. People died en masse. We saw a lot of the negligence happening inside those homes exposed as a result. And it kind of made me wonder if she would have been better off in long-term care or in someone else's care. Do you think we're collectively guilty for our failure to care for the elderly in the same way that Ron is for his own mom's death?
Well, I think that's a question that we're going to have to struggle with for some time.
What do experts say needs to happen to prevent more deaths like the one of Ron Siwicki's mom?
I think what the folks that I had interviewed mentioned was like, one, we really do need to find a way to support caregivers and to sort of alleviate a lot of the burdens and pressures that are placed on them. So with Ron and with a lot of people, a lot of caregivers, it's a very isolating job, and caregiving can be really rewarding, but for a lot of people too, it can be really extremely stressful, and it can lead people to make poor decisions.
It feels like, based on this story and this caregiver situation and what we saw happening in long-term care homes over the course of the pandemic, that the whole system of elder care is broken. And I wonder what you think that says about us as a society.
What really stood out to me about this story and kind of why I wanted to look into this story is because I did get the sense that Ron is sort of in this weird sort of purgatory, where this really horrible thing happened and he carries the weight of it. And I kind of wanted to explore that because I feel like, in a sense, we're nationally feeling that as well in terms of, our own response, in part during the pandemic to what has happened in long-term care and to see things unfold on sort of a large scale. But what really kind of struck me was, I'd asked Ron about his thoughts on what was happening to seniors in long-term care now today. And he had been watching the news and keeping up with what was going on. He at one point had told me, like, well, my mom, she died at home where she wanted. He didn't say it explicitly, but she didn't die alone. She died with him. He was kind of appalled at people dying in hospital without their loved ones near them. I think we do have to kind of ask ourselves these questions. If Ron did deserve the sentence that he got, and if he deserves to carry this weight of his mother's death, what does that mean for the rest of us?
That's it for today. I'm Tamara Kandaker. Our producers are Madeline White and Kasia Mihailovich. David Crosby edits the show. Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thanks so much to Wency Leung. You can find her on Twitter or at theglobeandmail.com. And before I let you go today, I just want to ask you for a quick favor. If you liked this episode, take a minute to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. Maybe tweet it out or post it on Facebook or tell a friend. We're a brand new show, and word of mouth makes a world of difference with podcasts. Also, if you're not already following us, make sure to do that on your favorite podcast app. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.